Wherever you are on your leadership voyage, it starts here.
Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of Leadership Voyage, the podcast dedicated to your pursuit of becoming a great leader. My name is Jason Wick, your host. Feel free to contact me anytime at the email startyourvoyage@gmail.com. I'm happy to hear from you about any of the topics on the previous episodes, or if you have ideas for new topics, any of the above. Love to hear from you. And some folks have been reaching out. I've gotten many guests that way in the past, just so you all know. So don't hesitate to reach out if you have a topic you're interested in discussing, or you know someone who might be a great guest based on whatever topic that they are an expert in. Startyourvoyage@gmail.com. I had an interesting journey to get here this morning because I spent the last 10 minutes trying to troubleshoot my audio issues. And after tweaking settings, rebooting my computer, and so on and so forth, realized that the microphone cable wasn't plugged in. So got that figured out, and we are ready to go today. I have a pretty exciting episode. Something that's really important to me personally is the process of decision making. And I read an article back in March, kind of bookmarked it and set it aside and read it again. And it kind of served as a catalyst to bring a handful of things together for me, where I think there's just some really important things to discuss about the process. And I'm going to lay this show out into 4 parts. They're all pretty short, but the 4 parts are first going through this Wall Street Journal article that I just mentioned, an article that I noticed back in March. Secondly, is the discussing kind of the pressure people feel to make quick decisions. Third, um, how much information does someone need to make a good decision? And then fourth, how can you get better at making decisions? So, Wall Street Journal article talking about the pressure to be decisive and act quickly, looking at how much information we might need, and finally, how do you get better? And for each of these sections, we've got sources to talk through as usual, um, augmented by my own thoughts. So let's dive in, right? There's an article in the Wall Street Journal, of which I'm a subscriber. Let's see, it's in the business section, March 14th, 2025, by Naomi Rothman, who is a professor at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania, professor of management at Lehigh University. The title of this article is "The Best Leaders Aren't Decisive, They're Ambivalent." And then it says conventional wisdom is that you want a boss who's decisive and resolute about the path forward, but that has it backward. And my guess is for those of you who just heard that, if you're really engaged in listening to that, you're thinking, that really, this article sounds backwards. Uh, what do you think of when you think of a strong leader? I'm sure a lot of characteristics come to mind, but more than likely, one of them that makes the top 5 traits is someone who is decisive or resolute. It doesn't mean that they're not open to hearing input. Maybe it's not mutually exclusive, but I suspect for many of you, you would associate decisiveness, courage, right, in as something that's synonymous with strong leadership. So let's step through this article. First of all, it talks about what is the picture we have of a successful leader. And it talks about someone who's decisive, in control, has very little doubt. And as it already suggested up top, This article suggests, based on research, that this is backwards. They've got 20 decades worth of research that they are drawing from here around the relationship between leaders' decision making and the success in their organizations. And what the author is calling out here is that the most effective environments that they've studied are where the leader who has the decision making power questions themselves. I'll say that again. The organizations where they've been most effective, where they've studied this relationship between decision making and organizational success, is where the leaders question themselves. Particularly in complex situations, is where this is an asset. Not seeing things as black and white, being receptive to contradictory evidence. I know we can all relate to confirmation bias when we already think something is the way it is, and then we just see that answer wherever we look. And what this research suggests is by being open to contradictions, by leveraging that evidence to evolve your opinion of a situation, your assessment of a situation, that is in the best interests of the decision-making process and the organization's success. So, as it's suggested up top in this article, we have a kind of a prototypical leader, right? This person who doesn't doubt themselves, is in control, decisive. So there's a challenge if people are ambivalent in decision making, because being definitive generally leads people to leadership opportunities, promotions, etc. People who are called ambivalent, perceived as ambivalent, are generally considered weak. But again, as they dove into a variety of studies in this article, there's a link to the article in the show notes, so feel free to check it out. But when you have this process of ambivalence in the decision making, it shows you have better results because you're including more perspectives. As a result, teams themselves below the leaders are more curious, kind of learning by example. And the teams think that the leader themselves is a better listener because they're seeking out other perspectives, contradictory evidence. So let's say you buy into this idea, and I'm going to get into the word ambivalent right at the end of this section, because some of you may be going ambivalent. Okay, that's just not a positive word to me. Well, we'll get into that in a second. But in this article, it talks about how do you build ambivalence in decision making, and there are 3 ideas. The first is acknowledge your internal conflict. And I can understand what this means. Sometimes if there's something nagging at us, we suppress that thought. If there's something there's that one little bit of evidence that's in the way of what I believe and what I think I should do right now, I'm just going to ignore that because it's a small thing that's back there in my mind. Let's just forge ahead. So first step is acknowledging that internal conflict, providing space for that thought and to actually think about it and assess it and analyze it. Second is to pursue internal conflict. I find this one interesting. Not only acknowledge, as it said in step 1 of building ambivalence, but pursuing internal conflict. How do you do that? Well, it says if you journal, if you engage in the arts, then you are experiencing more of a range of emotions, particularly in the arts where you might have the tension of multiple emotions stacked on top of each other during a single experience. I find this fascinating. So pursuing internal conflict is a second thing to do to build ambivalence. And then third is talks about building a new culture. In other words, in your organization or with your team, whatever your purview might be, make it clear that questioning yourself is a part of the decision-making process. So just normalizing that, which I found interesting. Also, put systems in place to skew the odds in favor of people embracing their internal conflict. I haven't really thought about what this might look like, but baking it in some form that people will indeed acknowledge and pursue their own internal conflicts. Because if you think back to what it was saying in the beginning, being ambivalent suggested embracing the internal conflicts you have, seeing the different perspectives, acknowledging the holes maybe in what you think right now, all of those different things, being receptive to contradictory evidence beyond what you hold to be true or what you want perhaps to be true. So acknowledge internal conflict, pursue internal conflict, and build new culture. Those are the three things that the author suggests for building ambivalence. That's the summary of the article. Now, here's the thing. The comments, the internet is a dangerous place, right? The comments underneath this are scathing, or at least the ones that rose to the top, which perhaps isn't surprising. But what I observed is when we read through these comments, and many people, say, I've talked to dozens of CEOs and they're all decisive, or the word, ambivalence is absurd. It's wishy-washy. You don't want to be that. What I found is these comments are maybe getting a little bit hung up on semantics. What's the difference between ambivalence and being wishy-washy versus being aloof? Let's kind of separate those three terms for a second. Ambivalent means that you have mixed or contradictory feelings about something. Okay? Aloof means you're maybe distant, detached, or uninterested. And wishy-washy means you're indecisive, uncertain, or lacking strong opinions, perhaps even lacking the courage to take a stance. Let's have a grown-up discussion here, right? The internet, again, is a dangerous place. No matter what your connotations were coming into today about the word ambivalence, let's try to set it aside and talk about what the author is saying. Because I think this terminology is getting in the way of their point. Their point is we should see different perspectives during the process of coming to deciding on something. I think that's the takeaway. And that the research shows when people do acknowledge the different sides that are out there to consider, when people do seek out contradictory evidence and opinions, that their organizations are more successful because they've considered more angles, their teams model the behavior, and the people who work for them and follow them are better, perceive them to be better listeners. And so all of this comes along for the ride. I don't think, and I'm speaking for the author here, but I guess I'll just speak my own opinions. This doesn't mean that you aren't decisive at the point of making the decision. This doesn't mean that once you decide, you back off. You can still monitor the decision closely, continue to look for more feedback and data as it comes in, and adjust along the way. In an odd way, I almost found the comments on this Wall Street Journal article a microcosm, excuse me, not a microcosm. Actually a microcosm of what the article suggests gives you lower results in decision making. Being extremely black and white, shutting down other opinions, and not being willing to listen to something that doesn't fit into what you already believe, also known as confirmation bias. So I just encourage you all to think for a minute. Yes, this is academic research, but it is still studies that we can leverage to improve ourselves. And that's the point of this podcast. Help people wherever they are on their leadership journeys. So don't get hung up on the word ambivalence and instead think about the different ways along the process of decision making that this article suggests you can get better results with your teams and with your businesses, your organizations. That's the key. Okay, that closes up the first section, this Wall Street Journal article. And as I said, the link is in the show notes for you. Second, when we're making decisions, we often feel the pressure, right? We have to take action fast. We have to have the answer as soon as our manager asks us the question. What do you think about that? And I was so lucky in season 2, episode 10, to have the great Michael Watkins on this show, the author of The First 90 Days. And he has a new book out as well. I've got to track him down, hopefully get him on the show again. But you know what? I took the opportunity to ask him if he had any wisdom to share with us around decision making.
So it actually connects fairly deeply to making successful transitions, right? Because as you're taking a new role, you're going to feel internal pressure to start to make decisions and take action. I call it the action imperative, right? That internal pressure. Oh, Jason says to himself, I need to prove myself. I need to show whoever they are that they made the right choice in putting me in this role. And that can lead you to make decisions perhaps before you're as informed as you need to be. And so I always say, basically, look, think about balancing, almost like a triangle, right? Of learning and connecting on one side, deciding and acting on the other, and reflecting and planning on the bottom, right? And sort of you're moving around that cycle. And don't get driven to making consequential decisions too early.
What great advice, right? Are we in fast-paced, high-pressure environments? Yeah. Is the world around us changing rapidly with AI? Yeah. Are the growth pressures on businesses with private equity acquisitions, those folks on those folks on boards all over the country, right? And intense pressure? Yeah, of course. But the question is, how much pressure do you feel to take action and show your worth? How much are you trying to impress someone? And therefore feeling what Michael Watkins said, this action imperative. I definitely am a kind of person who, when I have something I want to finish, the the urgency to check that box and get it done can be pretty intense. And I can understand the action imperative. I want to finish this and show whoever was asking about it or asking for it that I have got it figured out and it is good to go. And this is what I think about it. Let's go. Once again, we're getting into a gray area. It's not mutually exclusive to slow down, get information, and then still formulate a cohesive hypothesis, have conviction, and roll that thing out with confidence. I don't know about you, but wouldn't you feel more confident if you took a little extra time to consider some more alternatives? Absolutely, I would. You're not going to think of every alternative. You're not going to think of every competing idea, but you'll think of some. You'll come up with some. You'll ask others for some. How much extra time does that take you? I mean, think about the decisions you might have to make on a daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly basis. Some of them take a long time, right? But many of them probably do not. We're talking about on the order of days, right? You tell me if I'm wrong. Startyourvoyage@gmail.com. I'd love to hear your thoughts. But let's make better decisions by following the process that yields better results. Bring a few people along on the way. It takes a little more time, but the second order and third order benefits could be well better, or well beyond what you're thinking the first order benefit is. So that takes us to the third section, which relates to what Michael Watkins was just talking about and what I was just adding to, which is Well, how much information do I need to make a decision? How long do I need to take to make a good decision? I'm going to pull out two big names in this section. The first is Jeff Bezos of Amazon, of course. The second, the Pareto principle, as I learned about it from Bain and Company, the consulting firm. And so, first, Jeff Bezos, I think he's been talking about it in multiple shareholder letters, but the first I heard of it was around the 2016, 17, 18 era. And, it talks about this difference between 70% of information and 90% of information. You can have your own opinions on it. I've mentioned this on the show before. He suggested make a decision when you have 70% of the information rather than waiting till you have 90% of the information. And I think that's totally valid. I mean, how do you know when it's 70 or 90%? I don't know. That's for you to figure out, I suppose. But I suppose you can feel a little bit better if you go out and get some, as we said, some contradictory evidence or some other opinions from people who are different than you, something like that. And again, how much time will that take? I don't know. But the point there, I think what we tend to focus on is don't wait too long to make a decision because you're not getting the benefits of the extra 20% of information between 70 and 90. But let's not forget that maybe there are people making decisions before they have 70% of the information too. Okay? The Bezos comment, I think, is targeted at people who are perhaps veering towards analysis paralysis. And that's fair. But let's also be fair and talk about maybe we should apply the 70% to decision-making processes that don't gather enough information, that aren't getting more than perhaps 50%. Now, I learned about the Pareto principle. I'd heard, it's funny, I'd heard 80-20 or 20-80 or Pareto many times, but it wasn't until a couple of years ago that I actually had a good explanation given to me. So, first off, Pareto was an Italian who observed that 20% of the people in Italy, I think I've got this right, 20% of the people in Italy owned 80% of the land. Said slightly differently, 80% of the country was owned by 20% of its inhabitants. Now, when I took some training with Bain and Company, the way that they interpret this, the Pareto principle, the way that they interpreted this is around working efficiently. In other words, this idea that you get the greatest positive impact if you focus on the highest impact areas you're looking into with the minimal amount of effort. In other words, the way that Bain looks at this is you can get about 80% of the results from the first 20% of the effort. I think that assumes it's a smart effort. Again, the highest impact areas. And that after that, you could work on and on and on and on and on and on, but the ROI on that is very low. You may or may not have strong opinions about this, but I think this is a helpful thing to think through here. You have a decision to make. What are the important things you're trying to analyze, understand, learn, gather? And what are those most important 20% of your effort going to go to? Front load your effort in the important things that you need to understand. So whether it's make a decision after you have 70% of the information, or 20% of the effort gets you 80% of the results, I think what we're hearing is that there's a strong consensus around making decisions quickly by front loading the most important information. And I think it's pretty hard to argue against that. But when we get to the section here at the end, the fourth one, well, what the heck? What's the important information? How do you know what's important? How do I know I'm making a good decision? How do I know that my process is good? This article in the Wall Street Journal talks about building ambivalence, but what are you asking about when you talk to others and bring them in? What are the questions that you're drawing from to help get you the best information and insights that you can in this process? And my answer is not to tell you what those questions are, but to give you a model, and I didn't invent it, I will tell you who it is from, a model for improving your decision making. And I have had a decision making journal going back to the year 2018. Okay. And the reason I have a decision making journal is because of this group called Farnham Street. Farnam, Farnham Street. And I was a member for a little while, and there's a decision journal template. And it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. You need to engage in purposeful practice if you're going to get better at navigating gray areas of decision making. And I don't know many decisions that are black and white. Otherwise, it wouldn't be much of a decision to discuss, right? And even then, if it seems like a no-brainer, you don't know what the rest of the what the variables that make things complex around it say over the next 1, 3, 6 months. So I've got a link to this as well for you. It's the Farnham Street Decision Making Journal template. And what does this look like? I'll give you an example. You write down the date and the time of the decision. Okay, just going through the rigor of writing this down could even influence your decision itself. You write down the date and time in your own handwriting, okay? When you see your handwriting, it's much harder when you look back to rationalize. You write it down and you say what your decision was. You write down how you felt mentally and physically at the time that you made it. You write down something about the situation, about the context. Kind of define the problem state or the problem frame. What are the variables to consider? What were the complications and complexities? What alternatives did you consider? What's the range of outcomes that you think could happen? And then what is your expectation and the probability of your expectation happening? And what happens here is as you look backwards, later, you have to go back a few months later. They suggest 6 months. When you go back and look at your decisions, you'll learn from reading about them. Oh, this is what I was thinking then, but I didn't see that. And my argument is that as you engage in that process, just like any other thing of purposeful practice, you're going to get better at it. You're not going to have a straight line. It's not linear progress, right? You're going to make bad decisions, but you're going to be better at the process. And I think what's interesting is even if you follow a rate process, you still might get a bad outcome because the tariffs happened, right? I don't know, something crazy that uh, maybe you didn't foresee or you didn't want to acknowledge was going to happen. But the outcome isn't just correlative. It's not just I made a decision and therefore the next thing happens. There's so much else going on that affects these decisions, right? Or maybe you can honestly look back at your own handwriting and you had a bad process. You had a poor decision-making process, but you got lucky with a great outcome. But it wasn't because of you. Something else happened and we got away with it, right? And that's what having it in your own handwriting is. And really going through the rigor of thinking about what's the situation, the problem state, the variables, complications, alternatives, range of outcomes, all these different things. It provides a really honest opportunity to look at your decision making. And so that's what I wanted to close it up with. So we talked about ambivalence in this article from the Wall Street Journal, arguing that we've got it backwards when it comes to being decisive in the process of decision making, right? Let's not get hung up on the word ambivalent as like a personality trait. Second, don't fall into what Michael Watkins called the action imperative, feeling the pressure to take action just to show your worth, even though you don't have good information. Third, 70% of the information, then you move. Or the Pareto principle from Bain, 20% of the effort gets you the highest impact of 80%. Whatever you think of that, it's interesting to consider. And then fourth, no matter what you do, even if you ignore everything you've heard about in this episode, go to number 4, start the decision journal. Evaluate your decisions. Be disciplined and look back at them. See where you had a good logic and where you were making sense and where you didn't. Where did emotion take over? Where were you afraid, right? All these different things. Leverage that to your advantage. Put yourself through purposeful practice, and you'll get better at navigating the gray areas of decision making. It's been my pleasure and my honor to have another episode of Leadership Voyage for you all today. Until next time, everybody take care.